woman returns from death with a terrifying message from Jesus. The steady beep of the heart monitor had been my constant companion for days. Then, in an instant, it transformed into that dreaded continuous tone. I heard my daughter Susan's muffled sob, felt her grip on my hand loosen as she whispered, "Goodbye, Mom." My grandson Ethan's sharp intake of breath, Caleb's footsteps as he turned away from my bed. Even Dr. Reynolds' quiet murmur time of death. But that wasn't the end of my story. No, it was just the beginning. I returned from death with a message that would shake the world to its core. The first line captures attention by starting at the moment of death, a universal fear and fascinating moment. It introduces key family members immediately, creating emotional investment. The last line hooks readers with the promise of something extraordinary while staying within the realm of possibility. No sci-fi elements, just the mystery of near-death experiences that many find compelling. My name is Margaret Bennett, and for most people in our small town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, I was just another elderly widow living in that old Victorian house on Maple Street. They'd see me at church every Sunday, shopping at Wilson's Grocery on Wednesdays, or tending to my roses in the front yard. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that 30 years ago, I had been at the forefront of understanding how the human mind works. I spent 20 years as a psychology professor at Boston University, specializing in human consciousness and decision-making. My research focused on understanding how people make choices under pressure, how faith influences decision-making, and the profound impact of technology on human behavior. It wasn't the kind of work that made headlines, but it was important, meaningful, and most importantly, it was honest. That all changed in 1994. I had just completed a groundbreaking study on moral decision-making in the digital age. The paper was set to be published in a prestigious journal, and several major universities were interested in implementing my findings into their ethics programs. But then everything fell apart. Robert Maxwell, my research partner and someone I had trusted completely, had other plans. The day before our presentation to the ethics board, he submitted the research under his name alone, claiming I had merely assisted with data collection. He had carefully manipulated records over months, slowly building his case while maintaining a facade of friendship. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. Robert had been a friend, had eaten at my dinner table, had watched my children grow up. The university investigation that followed was a nightmare. It was my word against his, and he had spent months preparing his deception. He had friends in high places, connections I couldn't match. Every piece of evidence I presented was countered with carefully crafted documentation showing his version of events. My reputation, built over decades of honest work, was systematically destroyed. The academic world can be cruel when it turns against you. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid me. Research partners suddenly became too busy to return calls. The whispers followed me down hallways. "That's Margaret Bennett, the one who tried to steal Maxwell's work." The irony was bitter enough to choke on. I could have fought harder, could have taken legal action, but my husband Thomas had just been diagnosed with cancer. Our savings went to his treatment, and my energy went to caring for him. Susan was in college then, and I couldn't bear to let this scandal affect her future. So I did what felt impossible. I walked away. I resigned from my position, packed up my office, and left behind the world I had helped build. Thomas passed away 5 years later, never knowing the full truth about what happened. I threw myself into volunteer work at the church, finding solace in faith when science had betrayed me. I watched from afar as Robert Maxwell built his career on my research, winning accolades and positions of prominence. His paper, My Paper, became required reading in universities across the country. But God has a way of working that we can't always understand. As I would later learn, that betrayal, painful as it was preparing me for something far more important. The insights I had gained about human nature, about the intersection of technology and morality, about the capacity for both good and evil in the human heart, they would all prove crucial in understanding the message I would eventually be chosen to deliver. The irony wasn't lost on me that after decades of studying human consciousness and near-death experiences, I would end up having one of the most profound such experiences ever documented. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, you need to understand that I wasn't just some senile old woman who had a vision. I was someone who had spent a lifetime trying to understand the human mind and soul, only to discover that some truths can't be found in research papers or laboratory experiments. My family was both my greatest comfort and my deepest worry. Susan, my daughter, had followed a path that seemed destined to intersect with my past, though she didn't know it yet. At 43, she had made a name for herself as an investigative journalist specializing in corporate ethics and technology. She wrote for the Boston Globe, exposing the dark underbelly of the tech world with an almost obsessive determination. I often wondered if she had unconsciously inherited my need to uncover truth, or if it was God's way of bringing things full circle. Susan had married young and divorced early, raising my grandsons largely on her own. Ethan, the older one at 25, had his father's dark hair and my stubborn chin. He worked as a cybersecurity consultant, though I suspected some of his work ventured into grayer areas. He had a strong moral compass but believed that sometimes you had to bend rules to serve justice. I saw in him the same fire that had once driven me the need to right wrongs, no matter the cost. Caleb, 23, was different. Quieter, more cautious, he had recently taken a job at Maxwell Technologies, the very company founded by the man who had stolen my work. Of course, Caleb didn't know this history. To him, Robert Maxwell was just another tech mogul, and Maxwell Technologies was his ticket to a promising career. The irony of it ate at me daily, but I kept my silence. How could I tell him that his prestigious job was built on his grandmother's stolen dreams? The boys visited every Sunday without fail, though I suspected it was as much to check on their mother as it was to see me. Susan worried them with her intense work schedule and single-minded focus on her investigations. She had been working on a big story for months, something about unethical practices in AI development, though she was tight-lipped about the details. If only she knew how close to home her investigation would lead her. Our family dinners were a study in unspoken tensions. Caleb would talk excitedly about his work, while Ethan made subtle jabs about corporate ethics. Susan would probe her younger son with seemingly casual questions about his company, her journalist mind always working. I would sit quietly, serving pot roast and apple pie, watching the threads of past and present weaving themselves together in ways my family couldn't yet see. The dynamic shifted subtly after Thomas passed away. Susan became more protective, calling twice daily to check on me. Ethan started handling my finances, setting up automatic payments and monitoring my accounts for any irregularities. Caleb took over house maintenance, spending his Saturdays fixing leaky faucets and squeaky doors. They created a safety net around me, never realizing I was protecting them too, keeping my secrets to shield them from old wounds. And church was our common ground. Despite their different paths, both boys still attended service with me most Sundays, a tradition their mother had instilled in them. Susan would come when her work allowed, though I noticed she spent more time studying the congregation than listening to the sermon. Even there, her investigative instincts never rested. We weren't perfect, but we were bound by love and shared history, even if parts of that history remained hidden. I watched them grow, adapt, and chase their dreams, all while carrying the weight of knowing that soon everything they thought they knew about our family would be challenged. Looking back now, I see how God had positioned each of us precisely where we needed to be. Susan's investigative skills, Ethan's technical expertise, even Caleb's position at Maxwell Technologies all would prove crucial in the events that were about to unfold. But at the time, we were just a normal family, dealing with normal struggles, unaware that we were on the brink of something that would change not just our lives, but potentially the course of human history. The last time we were all together before everything changed was a typical Sunday dinner. Susan was distracted, checking her phone for emails about her story. Ethan was telling us about a security flaw he'd discovered, careful to keep the details vague. Caleb was excited about a new project at work, something involving neural networks, the very field I had once helped pioneer. I remember watching them, my heart full of love and fear, knowing that soon our comfortable family dynamic would be tested in ways none of us could imagine. Looking back, the symptoms started on an ordinary Wednesday morning. I was tending to my roses, the late September sun warm on my back, when the first wave of dizziness hit. It wasn't the usual lightheadedness that sometimes came with standing too quickly. This was different, more intense, more purposeful, if illness can have purpose. I steadied myself against the porch railing, blinking away the dark spots dancing in my vision, and tried to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. By evening, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The room wouldn't stop spinning, and my thoughts felt scattered, like autumn leaves in a strong wind. I called Susan, trying to keep my voice steady, but mothers can't fool their daughters. She heard the tremor in my words, the careful way I had to pause between sentences to gather my strength. Within 20 minutes she was at my door, her press badge still hanging around her neck, her face tight with worry. "Mom, you're burning up," she said, her cool hand pressed against my forehead. I wanted to tell her I was fine, that she should go back to work, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself sinking into her arms, my legs suddenly unable to hold my weight. The last thing I remember clearly was her voice, sharp with fear, calling 911. The hospital was a blur of white walls and concerned faces. Dr. James Reynolds, a man I knew from church, took charge of my case. He was younger than most doctors I'd seen, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded me of my late husband. But there was something else in his expression when he looked at my test results, something that looked almost like recognition, followed quickly by concern. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, carefully choosing his words, "your symptoms are unusual. The way your nervous system is responding, it's not following any typical pattern we see in viral or bacterial infections." He paused, glancing at the monitors beside my bed. "We're going to need to run more tests." More tests turned into more days. Susan practically lived in the hospital room, working on her laptop while I drifted in and out of consciousness. Ethan and Caleb came whenever they could, their usual bickering set aside in the face of their grandmother's mysterious illness. I caught snippets of their conversations when they thought I was sleeping, Ethan's suspicious questions about the hospital's security protocols, Caleb's defensive responses about medical privacy laws. The symptoms got worse. My vision began to blur, not just around the edges but in strange patterns, like static on an old television. The headaches were constant, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. But worst of all were the dreams, vivid, terrifying visions of machinery and darkness, of humanity lost in a maze of its own creation. I would wake up gasping, the heart monitor beside my bed screaming its electronic alarm. Dr. Reynolds kept running tests, each one more sophisticated than the last. "Blood work, Maurice. Spinal taps, nothing provided answers." But I noticed how he lingered in my room, checking and rechecking my charts, his brow furrowed in what looked less like medical confusion and more like moral conflict. One night, when the hospital was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors, I caught him staring at my file with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so softly I wasn't sure I'd heard it. Before I could ask what he meant, he was gone, leaving me with an uneasy feeling that there was more to my illness than anyone was saying. A week into my hospital stay, Susan received a strange call. She stepped into the hallway to take it, but I could see her through the glass walls of my room. Her face went pale, then flushed with anger. When she came back, her hands were shaking as she packed up her laptop. "I have to check something out," she said, kissing my forehead. "I'll be back soon." There was a new urgency in her voice, the tone she got when she was onto a big story. That was the last time I saw her before everything changed. Within hours of her departure, my condition deteriorated rapidly. The room began to spin wildly, and the machines around me erupted in a chorus of alarms. Nurses rushed in, their voices urgent but distant, as if I was hearing them through water. Dr. Reynolds appeared, barking orders, his earlier gentleness replaced by desperate determination. I felt myself slipping away, but it wasn't peaceful like I'd always imagined death would be. It was violent, as if my consciousness was being torn from my body. Through the chaos, I heard Ethan arrive, heard him demanding answers in his angry, protective way. Caleb's voice joined his, unusually sharp, saying something about calling their mother. The last things I registered were fragments, the cold rush of medication in my veins, Dr. Reynolds' face hovering over mine with an expression of pure anguish, and the strange certainty that this wasn't a natural death at all. Then the darkness took me, not with a gentle embrace, but with the precision of a carefully executed plan. Death, I discovered, wasn't the end I had always imagined. The darkness that claimed me in that hospital room suddenly gave way to a light so pure, so absolute, that it defied all earthly description. It wasn't the harsh fluorescent glare of hospital corridors or the warm glow of sunset. This light was alive, conscious, embracing. It saw me, knew me, loved me with an intensity that made my heart ache. In this light, I was no longer a frail 70-year-old woman. The arthritis that had plagued my joints, the reading glasses I'd relied on, the slight tremor in my right hand, all were gone. I felt whole, complete, as if every broken piece of my life had been perfectly restored. The betrayals, the losses, the years of silent suffering, they didn't vanish, but they made sense in a way they never had before. Then he was there. Not appearing suddenly, not walking towards me, he was simply present, as if he had always been there, waiting. Jesus, not the gentle figure from stained glass windows or the solemn face from painted icons. This was the living Christ, with eyes that contained universes and a presence that radiated both absolute power and infinite tenderness. "Margaret," he said, and my name in his voice was like a song I had always known but somehow forgotten. "My child, your journey is not yet complete." His words weren't spoken in any language I knew, yet I understood them perfectly, felt them resonate in the very core of my being. He showed me visions then, not like watching a movie, but like living multiple lifetimes in the span of a heartbeat. I saw humanity standing at a crossroads, teetering between two vastly different futures. In one, technology and faith worked in harmony, enhancing our humanity while preserving our souls. In the other, we lost ourselves in our own creations, trading our divine spark for cold efficiency. "Watch," he commanded gently, and the visions became more specific. I saw my own past, not just my memories, but the ripple effects of every choice, every action. I saw how Robert Maxwell's theft of my work had set in motion a chain of events that led to this moment. I saw my daughter Susan, even now uncovering a truth that could shake the foundations of the technological empire built on that long-ago betrayal. But most importantly, I saw what was coming, not in clear, linear images, but in powerful impressions that branded themselves into my consciousness. I saw the choices that would soon face humanity, choices that would determine not just our future, but the very nature of what it means to be human. "Your silence was protection," Jesus said, addressing the guilt I had carried for 30 years. "But now your voice is needed. The truth you hid to protect your family must be revealed to protect all families." Questions flooded my mind. Why me? Why now? How could I possibly make a difference? But in his presence, these doubts felt small, insignificant. I understood that I had been chosen not despite my age and perceived weakness, but because of them. My very ordinariness would make the message impossible to ignore. Then he showed me one final vision, more immediate and urgent than the others. I saw my own body in the hospital room, surrounded by machines and grieving family. I saw Dr. Reynolds, tears streaming down his face as he checked for a pulse. I saw Ethan holding Caleb back as the monitors flatlined. And I saw Susan racing back to the hospital, clutching documents that would reveal a truth far darker than even she suspected. "Return," Jesus commanded, his voice filled with both authority and compassion. "Tell them what you have seen. Warn them of what is to come. The choice between light and darkness approaches faster than they know." I wanted to stay. Every fiber of my restored being yearned to remain in his presence, to bask in that perfect light and all-encompassing love. But I understood that this wasn't about what I wanted. It was about what was needed. "They won't believe me," I whispered, my first and only words in his presence. His smile was like the dawn breaking. "Some will doubt, others will mock, but those who need to hear will listen. Remember, Margaret, truth spoken in love has power beyond human understanding." The light began to fade, or perhaps I was the one fading from it. The last thing I heard was his voice, gentle yet firm. "Tell them what you have seen. Tell them what is coming. Tell them there is still time to choose the light." Then I was rushing back, pulled by an irresistible force toward my earthly body. The journey back was like traveling through a tunnel of memories, every joy, every sorrow, every moment of my life flashing past in reverse. But now each memory was illuminated with new understanding, each pattern of my life revealing its purpose in the greater design. The first sensation upon returning was pain, sharp, insistent, and undeniably physical. The peaceful weightlessness of my divine encounter gave way to the harsh reality of aging muscles and failing organs. But my eyes flew open, and the fluorescent hospital lights stabbed at my retinas like needles. The continuous tone of the flat-lined heart monitor suddenly erupted into a frenetic beeping as my heart thundered back to life. Mom Susan's scream pierced the air. She had been slumped in a chair beside my bed, her face buried in her hands. Now she stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of medical instruments that clattered to the floor. Ethan, who had been holding his brother by the window, spun around so quickly he nearly fell. Caleb's face went white as chalk, his mouth forming words that wouldn't come. Dr. Reynolds burst into the room, his tie askew and his usual composed demeanor shattered. "This is impossible," he muttered, checking the monitors with trembling hands. She was gone. I pronounced her. His voice trailed off as he pressed his stethoscope to my chest, listening to the strong, steady heartbeat that had been silent moments before. "Jesus," I managed to whisper, my throat raw and dry. I saw Jesus. The words came out raspy but clear, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Dr. Reynolds froze, his stethoscope still pressed against my chest. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw something flash across his face: recognition, fear, and what looked like guilt. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses rushed in, checking vital signs and adjusting equipment. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones, their professional demeanor barely concealing their shock. One of them crossed herself when she thought no one was looking. Another kept glancing at me as if expecting me to disappear. "Mrs. Bennett," Dr. Reynolds said, trying to maintain clinical detachment, "you were clinically dead for over 7 minutes. Do you understand what I'm saying?" His voice shook slightly on the word dead, and I noticed he wouldn't quite meet my eyes anymore. "I understand perfectly, James," I replied, using his first name for the first time, "and I understand why you're afraid." His head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise and fear. "But we'll talk about that later. Right now, there are more important things to discuss." Susan pushed through the medical staff to reach my bedside, gripping my hand so tightly it hurt. "Mom, what are you talking about? You need to rest. You've been through." I squeezed her hand, cutting off her words. "No, Susan. No more waiting. No more silence." I looked at each person in the room, my daughter with her journalist's questioning gaze, Ethan with his protective stance by the door, Caleb trying to disappear into the corner, and Dr. Reynolds hovering uncertainly between professional duty and personal fear. "I was sent back with a message," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "A message about truth, about choices, about the future we're racing toward without understanding the consequences. And it starts with what happened to me 30 years ago." Dr. Reynolds took a step toward the door. "Perhaps we should let Mrs. Bennett rest. This type of experience can be very disorienting." But Ethan moved to block his exit, arms crossed, his cybersecurity consultant's instincts clearly sensing something amiss. "No, doctor," I said firmly. "You need to hear this too. Especially you." The monitors beside my bed registered a slight increase in my heart rate, but my voice remained steady. "Because what happened to me tonight wasn't natural, was it? Just like what happened to my research 30 years ago wasn't natural. The truth has a way of coming full circle." Susan's grip on my hand tightened. "Mom, what research? What are you talking about?" I could see the investigative reporter in her coming alive, connecting dots she hadn't even known existed. "The research that Robert Maxwell stole," I said, watching Dr. Reynolds flinch at the name. "The research that your brother Caleb is now unknowingly using at Maxwell Technologies. The research that almost got me killed tonight." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor. In that moment, looking at the shocked faces around me, I realized that Jesus had been right. The truth, spoken in love but with unwavering certainty, had a power all its own. News travels fast in a small town, but divine messages travel faster. Within hours of my return, whispers began circulating through the hospital corridors. Nurses who had witnessed my revival spoke in hushed tones to their colleagues. Patients in nearby rooms who had heard the commotion shared garbled versions of events with their visitors. By morning, my story had already taken on a life of its own. The first reporter arrived before breakfast, not from the major networks, but from our local paper, the Millbrook Gazette. Sarah Chen, a young woman I recognized from church, stood awkwardly in my doorway with a notebook clutched to her chest. "Mrs. Bennett," she said hesitantly, "people are saying you came back from the dead with a message from God." Before I could respond, Susan stepped in, her protective instincts warring with her journalist's understanding of a breaking story. But I raised my hand to stop her. "Let her in, Susan. This needs to be told." Sarah's article, published the next day, was respectful, measured, and utterly ineffective at containing the wildfire of public interest that followed. Strange things began happening almost immediately. The lights in my hospital room would flicker every time I spoke about my experience. The television would turn itself on, always to static, whenever I mentioned specific details of what I'd seen. Visitors reported feeling an unexplainable warmth, a presence that lingered even after they left. Ethan, ever the skeptic, set up cameras and monitoring equipment in my room. Just to document everything he said, though I could see the worry in his eyes. Within hours, all his expensive equipment had mysteriously malfunctioned. The only recordings that survived showed inexplicable orbs of light floating around my bed during our conversations. The church crowd came first, Pastor Mike, the prayer group ladies, the Sunday school teachers. They sat quietly, listening with varying degrees of acceptance as I shared my experience. Some wept, others nodded in understanding, and a few stormed out in righteous indignation at what they considered blasphemy. But it was the unlikely visitors who truly signaled the beginning of something bigger. A quantum physicist from MIT showed up, asking detailed questions about the nature of consciousness during my experience. A Silicon Valley entrepreneur flew in on his private jet, seeking insights about the future of technology I'd glimpsed. Even a Vatican representative arrived quietly one evening, taking careful notes and saying little. Dr. Reynolds watched it all with growing unease. He had retreated into rigid professionalism, referring to my revival as an unusual medical event in his official reports. But I caught him lingering outside my room late at night, his face troubled, clearly wrestling with his conscience. Social media exploded with the story. Caleb, who monitored such things, reported that Millbrook Miracle was trending. Videos of people praying outside the hospital went viral. News vans began parking in the hospital lot, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like modern-day prayers. Mom, Susan said one evening, her laptop open to dozens of news tabs, "This is getting bigger than we can handle. People are calling you everything from a prophet to a hoax. We need to think about how to control this narrative." Her reporter's instincts were right, but she was thinking too small. "We don't control the narrative," Susan I replied, watching the sunset paint the hospital room in shades of gold. "The truth controls itself. Our job is simply to speak it as if in response to my words, the room's lights flickered in what had become a familiar pattern." The most powerful moment came when a group of tech workers from Maxwell Technologies arrived. Young, bright-eyed individuals who worked under my grandson Caleb, they came seeking not spiritual guidance but ethical clarity. We're working on projects, one of them confided, that keep us up at night. We need to know, what did you see about our future? Their presence confirmed what I had known since my return. This message wasn't just for the faithful or the fearful. It was for everyone who sensed that humanity stood at a crossroads, everyone who felt the weight of choices we barely understood. As the sun set on my 5th day back among the living, I looked out my window at the crowd gathered below. They held candles, creating a river of light in the growing darkness. Among them were faces from every walk of life, business people still in their suits, teenagers with their phones raised to record everything, elderly couples holding hands, young mothers with children on their hips. All seeking something: answers, hope, confirmation of their own beliefs, or perhaps just a glimpse of something beyond their understanding. "It's time," I said to my family gathered in the room. "Time to tell everything." Susan looked up from her notebook, Ethan from his damaged monitoring equipment, and Caleb from his phone. Even Dr. Reynolds, doing his final rounds, paused in the doorway. "Everything," Susan asked, understanding the implications. "But everything," I confirmed, "about the research, about Robert Maxwell, about what's really happening at his company, and about what I saw on the other side. The truth doesn't belong to us anymore. It belongs to them." I gestured to the crowd below. All of them. The lights flickered one final time, and in the momentary darkness, I felt again the divine presence, confirming that this was exactly how it was meant to unfold. The truth, once unleashed, has a way of multiplying like ripples in a pond. Each revelation led to new questions, each answer uncovered deeper mysteries. While I recovered in the hospital, my family began pulling at threads that had been loosely woven into our lives for decades, unraveling a tapestry of secrets none of us had fully understood. Susan was the first to make a breakthrough. She burst into my hospital room one morning, her face flushed with a mixture of triumph and disbelief. "Mom," she said, dropping a thick folder on my bed, "I found your old research papers, the ones before Maxwell. They're identical to the foundation patents Maxwell Technologies is using right now for their neural interface projects." She spread out documents across my blanket, yellowed papers from my university days alongside glossy modern printouts. The technical language had been updated, the terminology modernized, but the core concepts were unmistakably mine. "This isn't just plagiarism, Mom. This is theft on a corporate scale. They built an empire on your work." Ethan had been conducting his own investigation, diving deep into the digital realm he knew so well. "The hospital's security system was compromised the night you died," he reported, pacing beside my bed. "Someone had access to everything: your medical records, your test results, even the security cameras. And get this, the digital fingerprints? They lead straight back to Maxwell Technologies' private servers." But it was Caleb who made the most disturbing discovery. Working inside Maxwell Technologies, he had access to areas his brother's hacking couldn't reach. "There's a project," he whispered during a late-night visit, constantly glancing over his shoulder. "They call it legacy integration. They're using your old research, Grandma, but they're taking it in a direction that feels wrong. They're not just studying human consciousness anymore, they're trying to alter it." Dr. Reynolds, meanwhile, became an unexpected ally. After days of obvious internal struggle, he finally broke down and confessed. "I was approached by Maxwell Technologies 2 months ago," he admitted, his voice trembling. "They said they needed a doctor to monitor a particular patient, you, Mrs. Bennett. They told me it was for a routine study, but they paid far too much for routine observation. When your symptoms started matching their predictions exactly, I knew something was wrong. But by then, I was already compromised." The doctor's confession shed new light on my mysterious illness. It hadn't been natural at all, it had been engineered, a calculated attempt to silence me before Susan's investigation could uncover the truth. But they hadn't counted on divine intervention. Each new piece of information painted a more complex picture. Maxwell Technologies wasn't just a technology company, it was the center of a web that had ensnared our family for generations. Robert Maxwell hadn't simply stolen my research, he had used it as the foundation for something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. Susan's investigation began connecting dots across decades. Maxwell's been systematically targeting researchers in consciousness studies, she explained, pinning articles and photos to the wall of my hospital room. Every major breakthrough in the field over the past 30 years, the researchers either disappeared from academia entirely or suddenly started working for Maxwell. Mom, you weren't the first victim. You were just the first one who came back to expose it. Ethan discovered a pattern in the company's recent activities. They're rushing something, he said, showing us lines of code on his laptop. All their major projects are being accelerated. It's like they're racing against a clock we can't see. He paused, looking troubled. Or maybe they're racing against what Grandma saw in her vision. Caleb's position became increasingly precarious. His access to inside information was valuable, but each day brought new risks. They're watching everyone, he reported. Security's been tightened. They're running background checks on employees' families. It's only a matter of time before they realize who I am, who we are. The most chilling revelation came from an unexpected source. A janitor at Maxwell Technologies, an elderly man named Frank, sought me out after hearing my story. I've been there since the beginning, he said, his weathered hands clutching his maintenance keys. I remember when Dr. Maxwell first brought your research in. He was excited, yes, but also scared. He kept talking about how it was too powerful to be public, how it had to be controlled. Mrs. Bennett. I don't think he stole your work to make money. I think he stole it because he was afraid of what would happen if someone else got to it first. These revelations wove together into a tapestry far darker than any of us had imagined. My simple story of academic theft had evolved into something far more complex, a decades-long conspiracy involving corporate power, suppressed research, and a fundamental question about the future of human consciousness. The first sign that we were in real danger came 3 days after my story hit the national news. Susan's apartment was broken into while she was visiting me at the hospital. Nothing was stolen, but her research files were meticulously rifled through, and her laptop containing months of investigation notes was missing. The police called it a routine burglary. We knew better. Then Ethan's car brakes failed on his way to work. He managed to navigate into a safety barrier with only minor injuries, but the mechanic who examined the vehicle was explicit the brake lines hadn't worn out, they'd been cleanly cut. Someone wanted to make it look like an accident, Ethan said from his hospital bed, a few rooms down from mine. They're sending us a message. Caleb started noticing dark cars parked outside his apartment, men in suits watching his movements. His security clearance at Maxwell Technologies was suddenly revoked for routine review, and his supervisor began questioning him about his family history. The pressure was visible in his face when he visited, the strain of maintaining his cover while knowing he was being watched. Dr. Reynolds received a more direct warning. His teenage daughter's school called one afternoon, reporting that a man had tried to pick her up, claiming to be her uncle. When confronted, the man disappeared, leaving behind only a business card with the Maxwell Technologies logo and a handwritten note, "Consider your next steps carefully." The supernatural occurrences around me intensified as well, taking on a more ominous tone. The hospital room's electronics would malfunction in patterns that spelled out warnings in Morse code. Ethan decoded one, a stop now. The temperature would drop dramatically whenever certain visitors arrived, as if something was trying to alert us to hidden dangers. One night, a nurse found all the security cameras on my floor had been spray-painted black. The same night, someone accessed the hospital's medication system, attempting to alter my prescriptions. Only Dr. Reynolds' vigilance caught the change before it reached me. They tried to prescribe you a combination that would have triggered cardiac arrest, he explained, his hands shaking as he adjusted my actual medication. Susan's journalist colleagues began distancing themselves from her story. Her editor at the Boston Globe called to say they were reconsidering the angle of her investigation. Sources who had been willing to talk suddenly went silent. They're being pressured, she said, frustration evident in her voice. Someone's calling in every favor, pulling every string to bury this story. The church community wasn't spared either. Pastor Mike called to tell me that significant donors had threatened to withdraw their support if he continued allowing prayer groups to gather in my name. The local newspaper that had first published my story printed a retraction, claiming factual inconsistencies in their reporting. Sarah Chen, the young reporter who wrote the original article, was fired. But the most frightening incident came when a man in a suit visited my hospital room late one night. He bypassed all security, somehow knowing exactly when my family would be absent. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable threat, "you have a lovely family. It would be a shame if your miraculous return led to their tragic departure before I could respond." He vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the cold weight of fear in my stomach. That same night I had another vision not as profound as my near-death experience, but clear enough. I saw Susan in danger, surrounded by shadows with human forms but empty souls. I saw Ethan discovering something that would put his life at risk. I saw Caleb being forced to make an impossible choice. The message was clear: time was running out. But we began taking precautions. Ethan set up a secure communication system for the family, using his cybersecurity expertise to create encrypted channels that even Maxwell Technologies couldn't crack. Susan stored her most damaging evidence in multiple locations, protected by a dead man's switch that would release everything to the media if anything happened to her. Dr. Reynolds moved his family to a safe house, only coming to the hospital for his shifts. Yet even as the danger mounted, more allies emerged from unexpected places. A group of former Maxwell Technologies employees reached out, offering testimonies about other stolen research, other silenced voices. A retired security guard sent us internal documents he'd secretly copied years ago, showing a pattern of corporate espionage and intimidation. Even some of Robert Maxwell's own family members began questioning his legacy, though they stayed anonymous for their own safety. Through it all, I maintained my resolve to share what I had seen on the other side. Each threat only confirmed the importance of the message. As Jesus had shown me, humanity stood at a crossroads, and the forces trying to silence us were proof that our choice of path mattered more than we knew. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening exactly 3 weeks after my return. I was finally due to be discharged from the hospital the next morning, but fate or something darker had other plans. Susan had left just minutes earlier to pick up some clothes from my house for the homecoming. The call came 15 minutes after she'd gone. "We have your daughter, Mrs. Bennett." The voice was distorted, mechanical. "She's unharmed, for now. You have a choice to make." My heart stopped, then started again with painful force. Through the hospital window, lightning split the sky, illuminating the empty parking lot below. "What do you want?" I asked, already knowing the answer. The voice confirmed my fears. "Recant your story. All of it. The near-death experience, the divine message, the accusations against Maxwell Technologies. Call it what it was: the confused hallucinations of an elderly woman under medication." They gave me 1 hour to make a televised statement. Local news had already been contacted. They were on their way. 1 hour to choose between truth and my daughter's life. The voice ended with chilling precision. "And Mrs. Bennett, we'll know if you try to include any hidden messages. No codes, no subtle hints, just a clear admission that it was all a lie." Ethan arrived moments later, his face ashen. He'd been monitoring Susan's phone signal, which had suddenly gone dead near the old Maxwell research facility on the outskirts of town. "They're keeping her there," he said, pulling up building schematics on his laptop. "It's perfect, abandoned, isolated, and technically still owned by Maxwell Technologies through a shell company." While Ethan worked to hack the facility's outdated security system, Caleb was fighting his own battle. "They're initiating something called Protocol Omega at work," he reported over our secure line. "Whatever they're planning, they're accelerating it. They're not just trying to silence us anymore, they're racing to finish something before the truth gets out." Dr. Reynolds arrived next, out of breath and soaking wet. They've locked down the hospital, he reported. Every exit is being watched, and there's more, they're uploading something to the hospital's main computer system. Some kind of program that's rewriting patient records, including yours. They're erasing the evidence of what happened here. The next 40 minutes were a blur of desperate planning. Ethan managed to access the facility's cameras, confirming Susan's location but also revealing the extent of our challenge. She's in the central lab, he reported grimly. At least 8 armed guards. And he paused, his face darkening. Robert Maxwell himself is there. The news vans were arriving outside, setting up their equipment in the rain. Through the window, I could see their lights piercing the darkness, waiting to broadcast either my surrender or what? What would happen if I refused to recant? The answer came in another call, this time from Susan herself. Mom. Her voice was steady despite everything. Don't you dare take back the truth. Not for me. They didn't blindfold me when they brought me in. I've seen what they're working on here. It's worse than we thought. Everything you saw. Everything Jesus warned you about, it's all real. They're not just studying consciousness anymore, they're trying to control it. To rewrite it, Mum, they have to be stopped. The call cut off abruptly. Thunder rolled overhead as if in response. We had 15 minutes left. Ethan looked up from his laptop, his expression grim but determined. I have a way, and he said. The old security protocols, the ones I've been studying, they're still active in the sub-basement. If I can trigger a specific sequence. But before he could finish, every electronic device in the room, the monitors, the phones, even Ethan's laptop suddenly went dark. In the silence that followed, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, purposeful steps approaching my room. The door opened, revealing a face I hadn't seen in 30 years but had never forgotten. Robert Maxwell stood there, his expensive suit slightly damp from the rain, his silver hair immaculate, his eyes exactly as cold as I remembered. "Hello, Margaret," he said softly. "It's time we finished what we started all those years ago." Robert Maxwell hadn't aged so much as crystallized, his features hardened by decades of carrying secrets. He stepped into the room with the confidence of someone used to controlling every situation, but I noticed a slight tremor in his left hand, the same nervous tick he'd had 30 years ago when he first stole my research. "You always were the stubborn one, Margaret," he said, closing the door behind him. "Brilliant, yes, but unable to see the bigger picture. Even now, you don't understand what's really at stake." He moved to the window, watching the news vans gathering below. Lightning flashed again, casting harsh shadows across his face. "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice stronger than I felt. "I understand that you built an empire on stolen dreams, that you're trying to play God with human consciousness, that you're willing to kidnap an innocent woman to keep your secrets." The machines around my bed remained dark, but the air seemed to crackle with unseen energy. Maxwell turned, something like pity crossing his features. "Stolen dreams? Is that what you think this is about?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I didn't steal your research, Margaret. I protected the world from it. You were going to publish everything, make it public domain. Do you have any idea what would have happened if those insights into human consciousness had become freely available?" Ethan moved to stand between us, but Maxwell waved him away like an irritating fly. "Your grandmother's work," he continued, "wasn't just groundbreaking. It was dangerous. It revealed things about the human mind that some people, many people, would misuse. I did what I had to do." By kidnapping my mother, Susan's voice crackled through Ethan's dead laptop, suddenly springing to life. The screen flickered, showing her face. She was still in the facility, but something had changed. "I'm in your systems now," she announced. "All of them. Turns out when you kidnap a journalist who grew up with a tech-savvy son, she might pick up a few tricks." Maxwell's composure cracked slightly. He pulled out his phone, but it was dead too. Every electronic device in the room had come under Susan's control. "Whatever you think you're doing," he started, but I cut him off. What I'm doing is telling the truth. Not just about the research, Robert, about what I saw on the other side. About the choice humanity is facing. I stood up from my hospital bed, the weakness of the past weeks falling away. Jesus didn't send me back just to expose your theft. He sent me back to warn everyone about where this technology is leading us. The room's lights began to flicker in a familiar pattern, but this time it felt deliberate, controlled. Through Ethan's laptop, we could hear alarms blaring at the Maxwell facility. Mom. Susan's voice came through clearly. I'm releasing everything. All the files, all the evidence, everything I've found. And something else, something they've been working on here. They call it Project Consciousness. It's exactly what you saw in your vision. Maxwell's face had gone pale. You don't understand what you're doing. The protocols we've put in place, the safeguards. Without them, everything I've built to protect humanity will collapse. He moved toward the laptop. But Caleb, who had slipped into the room unnoticed, blocked his path. No, Dr. Maxwell, my youngest grandson said, his voice firm. I've seen the project files. This isn't about protection. This is about control. And it ends tonight. Outside, the news van's lights suddenly swung toward the hospital windows, their beams cutting through the rain. The reporters had their story, but not the one Maxwell had planned. Through Ethan's laptop, we could see Susan making her way out of the facility, the security systems disabled, the guards in confusion. It's over, Robert, I said softly, but it doesn't have to end in destruction. Help us make it right. Help us choose the better future. Thunder rolled one final time as Maxwell looked around the room at the grandson whose company he'd helped build, at the elderly woman whose work he'd stolen, at the evidence of divine intervention he couldn't explain. In that moment I saw something crack behind his eyes, something that had been rigid for 30 years finally beginning to bend. The victory we thought we'd achieved shattered within hours. As Susan's expose began spreading across the internet, as Maxwell Technologies' stock plummeted, as reporters swarmed the hospital and the old research facility, a different kind of darkness descended upon our family. It started with Caleb. The stress of betraying his company, of standing against his mentor, proved too much. I found him in my hospital room at midnight, shaking, his eyes wild with guilt. They're all losing their jobs. Grandma, he said, his voice breaking. Thousands of people, good people, who had nothing to do with this. The entire research division is being shut down. Projects that could have helped people, cured diseases, all gone because of us. Then came the blow to Ethan. His cybersecurity firm, under pressure from their other corporate clients, terminated his contract. They're afraid, he explained, trying to sound casual about losing his life's work. Nobody wants to hire a hacker who took down a tech giant, even if it was for the right reasons. The strain showed in the new lines around his eyes, in the way his hands wouldn't stop fidgeting with his now useless security badges. But it was Susan who paid the heaviest price. Her kidnapping had left invisible scars deeper than any physical wound. She jumped at sudden noises, couldn't sleep without lights on, kept checking and rechecking the locks on her doors. Worse, her career, the thing she'd been most proud of, was in ruins. No newspaper would touch her. Now she was considered too controversial, too much of a liability. Dr. Reynolds was forced to resign from the hospital. Despite his eventual help in exposing the truth, the board couldn't overlook his initial involvement in Maxwell's plan. His family had to move, his children changed schools, and his reputation, built over decades of dedicated service, was permanently tarnished. The church community, which had once embraced my story, now seemed uncertain how to handle the aftermath. Some members stopped coming to services, uncomfortable with the controversy. Others whispered that my divine experience must have been fabricated, part of an elaborate scheme to seek revenge on Maxwell. Even Pastor Mike, though supportive, appeared relieved when I stopped attending regular services. The hardest part was watching my family try to hold together as everything else fell apart. Sunday dinners became quiet, tense affairs. Caleb and Ethan, once so close, now struggled to talk about anything meaningful. Susan threw herself into freelance work, taking any writing job she could find, but the spark had gone out of her eyes. I found myself lying awake at night, wrestling with doubt and guilt. Had I been wrong to share what I'd seen? The message had been delivered, the truth exposed, but at what cost? I thought of Jesus' words about truth spoken in love, but all I could see was the pain that truth had caused those I loved most. One particularly dark night, as I sat alone in my living room listening to the rain, I whispered a prayer that was more like a plea. Was this really your plan? To destroy my family to save strangers? The lights flickered once, softly, but offered no clear answer. The next morning I found a note from Susan on my kitchen table. Gone to clear my head, it read. Need some time to figure things out. She hadn't taken any clothes or her laptop, just her car keys, and the journal she'd started keeping after her kidnapping. My calls went straight to voicemail. As I stood there, holding her note, I realized that sometimes the cost of doing the right thing isn't paid all at once, but in small, painful installments of loss and regret. The truth had been told, but the price was still being counted. While our family struggled with personal losses, the ripples of our revelation spread far beyond Millbrook. Maxwell Technologies' collapse triggered a chain reaction throughout the tech industry, exposing fault lines that had been hidden for decades. The stock market plunged as investors frantically dumped shares in any company associated with consciousness research or neural interface technology. Competing firms rushed to distance themselves from Maxwell's methods, but their denials only raised more questions. How many other companies had built their empires on stolen research? How many other brilliant minds had been silenced? The academic world erupted in chaos. Universities that had partnered with Maxwell Technologies found their reputations tarnished, their research funding evaporating. Scholars began examining decades of technological advances with new skepticism, questioning the origins of breakthroughs that had seemed too good to be true. My old papers, now widely circulated online, sparked fierce debates about the ethics of consciousness research. Government investigations began, not just into Maxwell Technologies, but into the entire field of neural interface development. Congressional hearings were announced, whistleblowers emerged from other companies, and regulatory agencies scrambled to create new guidelines for technologies they barely understood. The question wasn't just about what had happened, but about what could happen if these technologies continued to develop unchecked. The media coverage turned increasingly dark. Stories emerged about research subjects who had disappeared over the years, about failed experiments that had been covered up, about files that had been destroyed just hours after Susan's expose went live. Each new revelation seemed to confirm the warnings in my divine message: humanity was racing toward a precipice, driven by forces we couldn't control. Religious leaders began speaking out, not just about my near-death experience, but about the broader implications of attempting to interface directly with human consciousness. Some called it an assault on the soul itself. Others saw it as proof that science had finally gone too far. The debate spread across denominations and faiths, with everyone trying to reconcile technological progress with spiritual beliefs. Then came the suicides. 3 former Maxwell Technologies researchers took their own lives within a week, leaving behind notes that hinted at guilt over unspecified projects. A mid-level manager disappeared, only to be found weeks later in a remote cabin, his walls covered with scrawled warnings about what's coming. These tragedies added a somber weight to what had already become a national crisis of conscience. The international response was equally severe. Countries began shutting down their neural research programs, fearful of public backlash. Silicon Valley investors pulled funding from anything remotely connected to consciousness studies. A field that had promised to revolutionize human existence was now toxic, tainted by association with Maxwell's crimes. But perhaps most troubling were the questions no one could answer. What had happened to all the research data collected over 30 years? Where were the prototypes, the test results, the failed experiments? Rumors circulated about secret servers, about technologies that had already been deployed without public knowledge, about breakthroughs that couldn't be undone. In the midst of this global upheaval, I received a letter from a young researcher in Switzerland, Mrs. Bennett. She wrote, "They're calling it the consciousness crisis, but that's not quite right. This isn't just about technology or ethics. This is about humanity's soul trying to warn its mind about the path we're on. Your experience. Your message, it came just in time. But I fear it may already be too late to undo everything that's been set in motion." As I read her words, the lights in my house flickered in that now familiar pattern, and I felt again the weight of what Jesus had shown me. This wasn't just about exposing past wrongs or preventing future ones. It was about a fundamental choice humanity needed to make about its own future, a choice that was becoming more urgent with each passing day. The truth, when it finally emerged, came from an unexpected source. 1 month after Susan's disappearance, Dr. Reynolds arrived at my door clutching a worn leather briefcase. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing documents yellowed with age. "I've been carrying these for 30 years, he said, spreading papers across my kitchen table. "I was just a medical student then, doing a rotation in Maxwell's private research facility. I saw things I didn't understand at the time, but I kept records. I thought someday they might matter." The documents told a story far different from what we'd believed. Robert Maxwell hadn't stolen my research out of greed or ambition. He'd done it out of fear of what he'd discovered in his own work. The papers showed that months before he encountered my research, Maxwell had achieved a breakthrough in consciousness studies that had terrified him. He found a way to digitize human consciousness, Dr. Reynolds explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Not just to map it or study it, but to actually extract it. The test subject, a volunteer, experienced something like a forced near-death experience. What they saw on the other side. He paused, hands shaking as he pulled out more documents. It wasn't divine, Mrs. Bennett. It was something else. Something that was waiting for us to open that door. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My research hadn't just been stolen, it had been suppressed, hidden away because it came too close to revealing what Maxwell had been desperately trying to prevent. He hadn't been trying to control consciousness, he'd been trying to protect it. More connections began emerging. The strange patterns of light that had followed my revival, the electronic disturbances, the way machines seemed to respond to my presence, these weren't divine signs. They were echoes of whatever Maxwell had awakened 3 decades ago, ripples in the fabric of consciousness itself. Dr. Reynolds continued, each word seeming to age him further. "Your near-death experience, Mrs. Bennett, it was real, but what you saw, what you interpreted as Jesus, Maxwell's research suggests it might have been something else, something that's been waiting for humanity to reach this technological threshold, wearing whatever face we're most likely to trust." The implications were staggering. The message I'd been spreading, the warnings about technology's dangers, they were right, but for reasons far more terrifying than I'd imagined. The choice humanity faced wasn't just about the ethical use of technology. It was about maintaining the very boundary between human consciousness and something that waited beyond it. "Susan figured it out," Dr. Reynolds said quietly. "That's why she disappeared. She found Maxwell's original records, hidden in the facility where they held her. She's not running away, Mrs. Bennett. She's trying to find proof of what's really out there, what's really waiting for us." As if in response to his words, every light in my house began to pulse, not in the familiar pattern of before, but in something new, something that felt less like communication and more like hunger. "Doctor." Reynolds watched, his face pale. "They're getting stronger," he whispered. "Every time we push the boundaries of consciousness, every time we try to digitize what makes us human, we weaken the barrier." I thought back to my experience, to the overwhelming love I'd felt, the certainty of divine purpose. Had it all been a deception? Or was there something even more complex at work, a battle for humanity's future being fought on levels we could barely comprehend? Redemption, when it came, arrived in layers like dawn breaking through different levels of darkness. 1 week after Dr. Reynolds's revelation, Robert Maxwell himself appeared at my door. He looked worn, diminished, a man carrying a burden too heavy for one soul to bear. "I've come to make things right," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Not just about the research, but about everything. The truth needs to be told, all of it." He pulled out a small device from his pocket, a simple black cube that hummed with barely perceptible energy. This is where it began, 30 years ago. The first consciousness interface. What we saw through it. What it showed us. As Maxwell spoke, Susan emerged from the shadows behind him. My daughter's face was thin, her eyes haunted but determined. "Mom," she said, "I'm sorry I disappeared, but I had to know. Had to see for myself." She held up a thick journal, its pages crammed with notes and diagrams. "Maxwell's been helping me understand what's really happening, what's really out there." Together, they told a story of redemption born from desperate necessity. Maxwell hadn't been protecting his empire, he'd been protecting humanity itself. Every stolen research project, every suppressed discovery, had been an attempt to keep humanity from opening doors we weren't ready to open. "Your experience was real," Margaret Maxwell said softly. "The divine presence you felt, the love, the message, all real. But it wasn't the only thing out there. There are others. Entities that would wear any mask, show us any truth we want to see, to achieve their own ends. I tried to stop them the wrong way, tried to control everything myself, and in doing so I became what I was fighting against." Susan reached for my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Maxwell's been helping me document everything, Mom. The real story. Not just about consciousness technology, but about what exists beyond our understanding. About the choice humanity really faces, not between good and evil use of technology, but between awareness and ignorance of what that technology might connect us to." The redemption wasn't just Maxwell's. Dr. Reynolds arrived, then Ethan, and finally Caleb. Each carried pieces of the truth. Each had played a role in both hiding and revealing it. As they shared their stories, the lights in my house flickered in complex patterns, not a haunting anymore, but a reminder of how thin the veil between worlds had become. "We can't stop the development of consciousness technology," Maxwell explained. "That door's already open. But we can help humanity understand what lies beyond it, help them prepare for the choice they'll have to make." He turned to me, finally meeting my eyes. "Your message wasn't wrong, Margaret. It just wasn't complete. We need to tell the whole truth now, together." The reconciliation spread beyond my living room. Maxwell publicly admitted his theft of my research, but also shared the reasons behind it. He established a foundation, funded by his personal fortune, dedicated to the ethical study of consciousness and the protection of humanity's spiritual autonomy. My family's reputations were restored, their sacrifices recognized not as acts of revenge, but as crucial steps in unveiling a greater truth. As the sun set on that day of revelations, I watched my reunited family, Susan deep in discussion with Maxwell about the Foundation's mission, Ethan and Caleb reconciling their different roles in the unfolding story, Dr. Reynolds finding peace in finally sharing his long-held secrets. The lights flickered one final time, and in that moment I understood that true redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about transforming it into a foundation for a better future. 6 months after the revelations in my living room, I stood before a packed auditorium at MIT, my family beside me, ready to share our story one final time. The audience included scientists, religious leaders, tech innovators, and ordinary people seeking understanding. They had come to hear not just about my near-death experience, but about the larger truth we had all discovered. The Margaret Bennett Foundation for Consciousness Studies had become a beacon of hope in a world grappling with the implications of our revelations. Under Susan's leadership, it fostered dialogue between science and spirituality, exploring the boundaries of human consciousness while respecting the mysteries that lay beyond. My daughter had found her true calling, not just exposing truth but helping humanity navigate it. Ethan and Caleb work together now, developing ethical guidelines for consciousness research. Their contrasting perspectives, Ethan's caution and Caleb's innovation, created a balance that the field desperately needed. They had transformed their painful experiences into wisdom, their rivalry into partnership. Dr. Reynolds had returned to medicine, but with a new purpose. He led a department studying near-death experiences, approaching them not with skepticism or blind faith, but with humble curiosity. His work helped bridge the gap between medical science and spiritual experience, showing how both could illuminate the human journey. Robert Maxwell, though retired from direct involvement in technology, served as a warning voice about the responsibilities that came with pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. His testimony before Congress helped shape new laws governing consciousness research, ensuring that future innovations would prioritize human spiritual autonomy. The supernatural occurrences that had followed my revival gradually subsided, but they left behind a lasting awareness of the thin veil between worlds. The flickering lights, the mysterious patterns, the sense of other presences all served as reminders that reality was far more complex than we had imagined. My own role evolved from reluctant messenger to elder counselor. People sought me out not just for my experience with death and return, but for the wisdom gained through our family's journey. I spoke of divine love and cosmic mysteries, but also of human courage and the importance of facing truth, no matter how challenging. The church community, initially divided by our story, found renewal in wrestling with deeper questions about faith and consciousness. Pastor Mike often invited me to share my perspective, showing how spiritual truth could encompass both traditional belief and new understanding. Our Sunday family dinners resumed, now filled with lively discussions about consciousness research, spiritual experiences, and the future of human knowledge. Where there had once been secrets and silence, there was now open dialogue and shared purpose. We had emerged from our trial not just intact, but transformed. Standing at my window today, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that remind me of that divine light, I reflect on the message that humanity needs to hear. It's not the simple warning I first thought it was, but a deeper truth about our place in the cosmos. Yes, humanity stands at a crossroads, but the choice isn't just between good and evil uses of technology. It's about maintaining our spiritual sovereignty while exploring the vast mysteries that surround us. The entities beyond our consciousness, whether divine, malevolent, or simply different, are real, but so is our capacity to choose how we engage with them. The truth that emerged from our family's ordeal is both simpler and more complex than we initially understood. Technology isn't our enemy, ignorance is. The greatest danger isn't in pushing boundaries, but in pushing them blindly without understanding what lies beyond. The divine presence I encountered was real, but it was one voice among many in a cosmic conversation humanity is just beginning to join. My near-death experience, Maxwell's research, Susan's investigation, our family's trials, all were pieces of a larger pattern. We are not alone in the universe, but we must be wise in how we reach out to what awaits us. The flickering lights that followed my return weren't just signs, they were reminders of how permeable the boundary between worlds has become. To the scientists pushing the boundaries of consciousness research, proceed with courage, but also with humility. To the spiritual seekers searching for deeper truth, keep your minds open, but your discernment sharp. To the tech innovators dreaming of neural interfaces and digital consciousness, remember that every advancement that connects us to the beyond also makes us more vulnerable to its influences. Our family story isn't just about death and return, corporate conspiracy, or technological danger. It's about humanity's next great leap, not into space or artificial intelligence, but into the reality of our own consciousness and what lies beyond it. The challenges ahead will require not just scientific brilliance or spiritual faith, but a marriage of both. The lights still flicker sometimes in my house, but I'm no longer afraid. I've learned to see them as reminders of the greater truth: we are not alone, we are not powerless, and our choices matter more than we know. The future belongs to those who can walk the line between worlds with both courage and wisdom. As I close this chapter of our story, I'm filled not with fear but with hope. Humanity may be standing at a crossroads, but we're standing there together, eyes open, hearts aware, ready to face whatever lies ahead. The message from beyond wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation to grow into our full potential as beings of both matter and spirit, science and faith, human and something more. The truth has set us free, not from danger but from ignorance. And in that freedom we find our true purpose to explore the mysteries of consciousness while maintaining our humanity, to reach for the stars while keeping our souls intact, to embrace both the divine and the digital with wisdom and love. What are your thoughts on Margaret Bennett's extraordinary journey? Share your reflections on the intersection of faith, technology, and human consciousness. Have you ever experienced something that made you question the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds? How do you feel about the role of technology in our spiritual evolution? Your perspective matters in this ongoing conversation about humanity's future. Share your story or insights in the comments below and join the discussion about where science, faith, and consciousness converge.